Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Before I turn it over to Dale, I think most of you know GBF is a nonprofit organization, and as such, part of our organizational structure is that we have a board of directors. I am your president, and yes, I'm guilty of collusion because we on the board collude together to try and make this community as welcoming and as wonderful as possible. So thank you for showing up. There are lots of opportunities to volunteer. This is an all-volunteer organization, and I see many of you who do volunteer regularly. If you are interested in getting more involved in the life of the Sangha, please feel free to speak to me or any of the board members. I'm going to name those board members. There are a number of them here today. Richard Azzolini, who also handled food today, and Tom Bruin. Folks who are not here are Peter Washburn, our treasurer, Pat McGraw, our assistant treasurer, Michael Altschuler, Greg James, who just joined as our secretary, and Tim Ryan, who's not officially on the board, but he attends our meetings, and he's our volunteer coordinator. Also just want to give a shout out to our program committee who do such great work, and Jeff Lindemuth for reaching out to Dale and inviting him, and finally to Dale for saying yes, Dale Borglum. Also, we hold this spring retreat, day-long retreat, as a gift to each other. The Sangha basically supports this event, so there's no registration fee. Lunch is provided, and we don't pay Dale, so we do rely on you to be generous with Dana. And the Dana Bowl is out where it usually lives, so please contribute as generously as you can. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dale Borglum. Thanks,
Thank
Dale.
you, Michael. Just a few logistics. First of all, I'm very glad to be here. Thank you, Jeff Barat, for inviting me. The schedule today will be a short introduction, sit, walk, talk, sit, walk, lunch, sit, walk, talk, sit, walk, close. The sittings will be about 40 minutes long. The walking periods will be about 20 minutes long. And at the end of the walking, somebody will ring a bell out in the front of the building if you choose to be walking outside. At the beginning of the first walking period, I will talk briefly about different styles of mindful walking. As well, right next to that model of the Dharma Center that some people might be building is several piles of my propaganda. There are a bunch of Living Dying Project newsletters. There is an announcement about the fact that this coming week, actually starting on Monday, there's an event here in the city called Reimagine the End of Life. And there are about 150 different people presenting about 150 different things throughout the Bay Area about end-of-life issues. And next Saturday, I am facilitating a one-day workshop at the Women's Building near the corner of 18th and Guerrero, between Guerrero and Valencia there. As well, there are some flyers about an ongoing group that I facilitate Monday nights in the city. Tom used to be in that group. He is a happy graduate. This is what happens. And I'm the director of the Living Dying Project, which was founded many years ago by Ramdas, Stephen Levine, and eventually myself, which was the first organization in the West to promote conscious dying. Today's all-day sitting does have a topic, which is passion and compassion. And now it's time to, no, wrong one. So my guess is that people here do different practices, but that in fact most people, since this is a Buddhist fellowship, have a practice that's based in awareness or mindfulness. I live right over the hill from Spirit Rock. I've done a lot of Vipassana meditation in my day. And as the decades have passed, it has become increasingly clear to me that bringing compassion into one's sitting practice as well as into one's daily life is a great both increase in motivation for practice, that I'm not practicing just for me to get free, but I'm practicing for all beings. But at the same time, compassion has the effect of speeding up practice. And I say that with some humor and quote marks about all of those words. But for instance, Richie Davidson, a academic at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who's a Buddhist psychologist, friend of the Dalai Lama, did a study where they developed measures of well-being. And they found that if you practice mindfulness, it increases well-being. No big surprise. But if you add compassion to your mindfulness practice, it greatly increases the sense of well-being. So compassion, as I'm sure we all know, is the ability to keep your heart open in the context of experiencing suffering. Not only the suffering of people around you, but your own suffering. The Dalai Lama famously says that if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. And my sense is that it is impossible to have lasting happiness or joy without a strong component of compassion in your practice. Certainly, if you just focus on awareness, you're a Zen student, you're a Vipassana student, and you dive deeply into awareness, eventually compassion arises on its own. Because if we really begin to become aware of how suffering arises, insight, meditation, we will begin to have compassion for that arising suffering. But it is possible to actively cultivate compassion as part of our practice. Compassion literally means with passion. Bringing our passion, our desire to be fully alive, into even the relationship with suffering. Now, traditionally, compassion is taught as, let's cultivate compassion for suffering humanity, for the people we know who are suffering, which it turns out is everybody we know. But because here in the West, we ourselves are suffering practitioners, it's very useful to cultivate compassion for the meditator, for he or she who is practicing. I was at a Tibetan Buddhist retreat a number of years ago, and the Lama came out and he said, okay, the first thing we need to do is we're going to open our hearts, so everybody please think about your mother. And then he said, oh, wait a minute, this is America. Thinking about your mother doesn't mean you're going to feel happy. Now, that's kind of funny, and it's really, really sad. Where he comes from, thinking of your mother opens your heart. Okay. So that these awareness practices that are so popular and that many of us in the room are practicing were developed by and for Asian people a few thousand years ago who loved their mother, who didn't wear shoes, who didn't have an iPhone, who didn't have a mortgage. A much more simple life. I'm not saying that life didn't have its own set of issues that made it more difficult to practice. But it is assumed in most practice that we begin relatively happy, relatively ready to begin this great project of disidentifying with character structure, with that which is separate, and beginning to identify with our basic goodness, with Buddha nature, with Christ consciousness. And yet, if we begin that project from the standpoint of neurosis, of not liking ourselves, or meditating because we're trying to get away from how much it hurts to be alive, then I don't think it takes too much imagination to see that pretty soon practice is going to get complicated, because he who is directing your practice is also partly the part of you that's trying to protect yourself. And things get kind of complicated. So, compassion is, as I said, the ability to keep your heart open in relationship to suffering. Stephen Levine poetically said, compassion is the ability to keep your heart open in hell. And right now I have two dear friends who in the last 2 weeks have both been told that they have a very, very dire cancer prognosis. One of them has 7 brain tumors, the other as well as metastases in her bones and her lungs. Another one has her ovarian cancer has come back, and the CA-125 markers are shooting through the ceiling. So they need to have compassion for what's going on in their lives. Maybe I shouldn't say they need to, but certainly to the extent they can, it makes this journey much softer, much more open and accessible in a certain way. But today, we're going to be sitting here quietly, walking mindfully. And my suggestion is that compassion can be learned in that much more subtle, moment-to-moment experience where you're sitting there. Maybe your practice is to watch your breath, or just to watch your mind, choiceless awareness or awareness of the breath. And at one point you will notice, oh, I'm thinking. I've been thinking for the last 2.5 minutes, or the last 2.5 seconds, or whatever it is. In that moment where you awaken, and you're aware that you're not on the selected object of awareness, what quality of body-mind arises when you come back to being present? Is there some subtle judgment where you're jerking yourself back to being present? Or can you come back to being present with kindness toward yourself? Even gratitude for seeing that here's another place where the ego structure overwhelmed our desire to have an open heart or to be present in our sitting. There's a woman named Brene Brown. Some of you may have heard of her. She has, at one point, and I think maybe still, the most viewed TED Talk of all time. She's an academic who talks about trust and vulnerability. She said a very interesting thing. She said, I interviewed 11,000 people over 12 years, and there was not one person out of 11,000 people that had a joyful life that didn't do one particular practice regularly. What do you think that practice was? Anybody want to make a guess?
Gratitude.
What?
Gratitude?
Correct. Gratitude. There's a lot of grumpy meditators. there's a lot of people who, and we know some of them, and sometimes we are some of them, right? That it's possible to be watching your mind and watching your body and saying, oh my God. And we're going to be here all day today. So that I would expect that for almost all of us, there are going to be chunks of time where it's difficult. The mind is getting agitated. The body would rather be moving about in the sunshine. Can we even have gratitude for those places? Because they are showing us this tension between the part of us that wants to be free, that trusts the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and the part of us that is identified with character structure, with ego structure, with our personality, that wants to protect, that isn't so sure it wants to be vulnerable. And that tension is going on all the time. Bringing compassion to that tension greatly softens and smooths that relationship with that which is uncomfortable. Are there any remarks about that before we begin our first sitting practice? In Buddhism, particularly when somebody is doing an all-day sitting or a longer sitting, it is traditional to take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. I'm sure that almost all of you have a rather deep understanding of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, but I have been instructed not to take anything for granted. And we will do that. We do it 3 times. We'll do it in English rather than Pali. The Buddha that we're taking refuge in is not the historical figure. We're taking refuge in the fact that freedom exists and it is our true nature. We don't have to fix things. We don't have to manipulate or understand anything. That by bringing awareness to the obscurations between us and who we actually are, not very good language there possibly, that just bringing awareness is bringing us on the path toward wholeness. We don't have to understand why the mind is doing what it's doing. We notice what's going on. We surrender back into being present. We die back into the next moment. We take refuge in the Dharma. There is a path to wholeness that works. And finally, we take refuge in the Sangha, which means that we're not practicing alone. There's 27 other people in this room, maybe 28 or 29. I think a few more straggled in after I counted. Okay. So that everybody else's practice is supporting your practice. Beyond that, right now, hundreds of thousands of people are practicing all around the world. Buddhists, Christians, Jews, Sufis, Muslims, shamans, whatever path people are choosing to find the truth, that their practice is supporting us. We can take refuge in that. And that not only that each one of these people, each one of us is standing on a lineage that goes all the way back to the Buddha and even before. Our teacher's teacher. That all of that is supporting us. So in taking refuge in that, can we relax? Can we trust that we can again and again die into the present moment? So what we're going to do is say, I take refuge. For the first time, I take refuge in the Buddha. For the first time, Dharma. First time, Sangha. For the second time, etc. And we'll do that together. For the first time, I take refuge in the Buddha. For the first time, I take refuge in the Dharma. For the first time, I take refuge in the Sangha. For the second time, I take refuge in the Buddha. For the second time, I take refuge in the Dharma. For the second time, I take refuge in the Sangha. For the third time, I take refuge in the Buddha. For the third time, I take refuge in the Dharma. For the third time, I take refuge in the Sangha. We'll have a 20-minute walking period in silence, and you can walk in the lobby. Slow, mindful walking. I'll give a very brief demonstration, or outside in the sunshine. At the end of that time, somebody will go to the front door and ring these bells rather loudly. So if there is any secret to practice, it is continuity of practice, and it is difficult to sit all day long, so we intersperse sitting and walking. The way it's traditionally taught in Vipassana, I'm sure many of you know, but you find a comfortable standing position, standing meditation, and then you just walk very slowly with the optional labeling of lifting, moving, placing, lifting, moving, placing. Or, if you don't want to use those words, just bringing awareness to the physical sensations that are attendant to the walking process down in your legs and in your feet particularly. Are there any questions about walking meditation? And I was told that there would be a place that if anybody wanted to talk to me individually about their practice, there was a room somewhere that I could, upstairs or something. Is that up there?
No, it's upstairs through the...
Okay. Is there anybody that would like to talk to me for a few minutes about your sitting practice? Oh, good. Okay. Okay, we'll do that. Okay, so please, walking meditation.
Back at what time?
At about 20 after 11, and there will be a bell. There will be a Dharma talk now, and as part of the Dharma talk, we will do some introductions. But I'd like the introductions to be a practice, not just saying names. Compassion has certain defining qualities of the heart, and one of them is a connected heart. Another is a spacious heart. Another is a warm heart. A heart that is warm, connected, spacious. So that even suggests that we can choose a practice for ourselves, that during meditation or during post-meditation or non-meditation, that you pick one of those qualities. Is your heart connected? Connected to yourself, connected to the people you're around, connected to the sacred? Or is your heart warm as opposed to a cool heart? We look around and we see aggression on the sidewalk. We see aggression politically, socially, ignorance. We see a lot of things that are, at first glance, possibly difficult to remain warm in relationship to. I like the quality of spaciousness, a spacious heart. One practice that I do is imagine that I am breathing the sky into my heart. I look at the sky, or I just imagine the sky and just breathe it into my heart, realizing that my heart is vast enough to not only include my own suffering, but the suffering in this room, the suffering in Washington, D.C., the suffering in the world, all sentient beings. We live in divisive times. I think that's pretty clear. And there are people who are very angry about what's happening. There are people who are very frustrated. There are people who are very depressed. I have very close family members who are on the other side of the political divide from me. So I have Thanksgiving with close family members, and we try to avoid talking about politics because it just doesn't work. Can I have compassion? I'm of a certain age that when I was going to graduate school down in Palo Alto, there was a war going on. And I felt a great deal of antipathy toward the president, the governor, the war. I was chased down the street by policemen, and I had no compassion for these policemen. I thought they were pigs. And I thought the politicians were stupid people. And in my lack of compassion, not only me, but certainly a generation, a collective sense of outrage that there was a great backlash that created the next 10 years. So that these swings back and forth, who's angry at who, goes on forever. The Buddha said that being angry at somebody is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It doesn't work. Can we have compassion for Donald Trump? Donald Trump will be at your bedside holding your hand when you are dying. Imagine that. Now, obviously, he's not going to take time off from his business ventures to actually be there. But any place in you that is reactive to the concept that those two words bring up in you will still be there. Can we begin to be aware of these automatic, unconscious reactions to that which we don't like, and begin to have compassion? If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. Imagine how simple your life would be if it was motivated by compassion in a moment-to-moment way. Not, am I getting enough? Do they like me? What's going to happen here? But what is the compassionate thing? Now, often we think of compassion as a one-directional event. I'm compassionate for the person I'm talking to. But compassion is really a state of being that includes you and the other person and everybody. It's being compassion. And it's not compassion for, it's compassion with. It requires empathy. It requires the willingness and the ability to feel what you imagine the other person is feeling. You don't just imagine what Donald Trump is feeling. You don't just imagine what your partner is feeling. You don't just imagine what the person who just cut you off in traffic is feeling. But you feel that. You're willing to feel the pain that is all around. And that rips our heart open. So, a spacious heart. Spacious means there's not a lot of I, me, and mine running around in your mind at that particular moment. There's a wonderful quote by Rumi, "Grief is the garden of compassion." Grief is the negative emotions that arise in response to feeling separate. Not just I'm sad because somebody died or somebody left, but anger, fear, narcissism. All these are emotions arising out of feeling separate. A sense of separateness from who we truly are, who that other person truly is, and our connectedness with the sacred. Compassion, as I mentioned, has the quality of connectedness. So that one way of looking at our practice is transmuting feelings of grief and separateness into feelings of connectedness and compassion. Grief is the garden of compassion. A garden being this place where something nourishing and or beautiful grows. Can something beautiful grow out of our grief? Everybody's grieving. Everybody in this room is grieving. And if you are actually actively grieving because of illness or death or addiction or people close to you being caught in certain things, if you are actually grieving, is it possible to let go of the story and be directly and nakedly with the feelings as they arise? Letting go, at least occasionally, of the concepts that keep us separate from the naked meeting of the sensations of the deeper experience. Many of us, most of the time, are really not in touch with our bodies. We're in touch with concepts of our bodies. We're not in touch with the people around us. We're in touch with concepts of who these people are. Once again, going back to this wonderful example that we have Donald Trump, we have concepts about who he is and why he should do this or why he shouldn't do that. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, people have very strong concepts about who he is and his behavior. What if we let go of those concepts and actually worked with feeling what we imagine that he's feeling? What if we could do that not just with him, but with the people that we meet? So, as part of an exercise, we're going to go around the room and we're going to introduce ourselves by first name. Is it just say your first name? Is that what the thing? We don't give our blood type or anything? Okay. So, you'll say your first name, and is it possible that as you're doing that you yourself are in your heart feeling compassion for this room, and as each person is saying their name, is it possible that we can feel that connection, that warm heart, that spacious heart? And I would guess that some people in this room have histories with other people in this room. You have positive histories, negative histories, questionable histories. Feelings come up when you think about a person, when they introduce themselves. And can you bring compassion so that it isn't just compassion for that other person, but for the part of you that has that relationship, whatever it may be. And it's just as easy to be lost, maybe even easier to be lost in the positive sense of relationship. Oh, good, there's my good friend. And you get lost in those feelings. It's easier to get lost in positive feelings because negative feelings inherently have a message that, hey, maybe there's something you want to do about this because this doesn't feel very good. Okay? Suffering arises. Three possibilities. Three possibilities. Pushing suffering away. My baby brother David, was informed of his terminal pancreatic cancer diagnosis by his Kaiser oncologist in an after-hours email? Can we have compassion for my brother? Maybe not so hard. Can we have compassion for the doctor, who had no training probably in having to tell a relatively young man with relatively young children that there was nothing more the medical community could do and he was almost certainly going to die pretty soon? Pushing suffering away. We all do that. Hundreds of times a day. Possibility number 2, suffering arises, we get lost in it. We become identified. Oh my God. The Bible talks about the peace that passes understanding. We're trying to understand our suffering, conceptualize it, become codependent. There is a third possibility, which is compassion with passion. It takes all of our passion to stay open to the suffering in this body, in this mind, in this world. Okay, so we're going to go around the room and do it as an exercise, and we'll start with...
My name is Jim.
That was easy.
I'm Don.
Gary. I'm Kay.
My name is Michael.
I'm Dale.
My name is Henry.
My name is Rich.
My name is Dennis.
Kevin.
Jack.
Tony.
My name is Ray.
Grisha.
I'm Mike.
Rick.
My name is Jeff.
My name is Tom.
I'm Jerry.
Jason. My name is Harley.
My name is Lee.
I'm Jim. I'm Richard. I'm Michael.
I'm Gene.
My name is Stephen.
I'm Larry.
Thank you. In English, when we're afraid, we say, I am afraid. I was kind of noticing some people would say name, or some people would say my name is, or some people would say I am. Okay, so in English we say I am afraid. In Spanish, people say I have fear. In Tibetan, people say fear is here. Think of how much more difficult it is to be a native English speaker. I am afraid. Are you really afraid? Or is there a passing mind-body state? I am afraid. I am compassionate. So that, in a way, compassion is really the center point, or even the tipping point in spiritual practice. Where in the beginning of practice, there's very much an I who is meditating, who is trying to get more clear, who is working with being present. And as that awareness deepens and compassion begins to arise, this need to have this I who is afraid begins to dissolve in the spaciousness that is the quality of compassion. So, my experience is that as my meditation deepens, I'm still neurotic. I had a girlfriend once who said, I really love you, but I never thought I'd be with somebody as neurotic as you. That completely lost my train of thought as I remembered her. Okay. So, my experience is that thoughts and emotions are still there, but in a much larger, spacious field. It's almost like my mind is the sky, and all this other stuff is the weather. Are you the sky or are you the weather? So that the thoughts, the images, the sensations, emotions are arising, but they're like further off in the sky. The volume is decreased. One doesn't take them quite so personally. Ram Dass has this great line, if you're a son of a bitch and you get enlightened, you'll be an enlightened son of a bitch. Right? It isn't that all these neurotic structures are immediately going to fall away. Some of them will remain. You have a personality structure. But is that who we are? Can we, by bringing compassion to these unconscious patterns that have been there for so very long, begin to lessen their hold on us? So modern neuroscience is finding that our neurology has evolved from prehistory in such a way that negative experiences, that we grab onto them and identify with them, we Velcro to negative experiences. And positive ones are like Teflon, they slide right through. Because long, long ago, our ancestors living on the savannah with saber-toothed tigers running around, or whatever kind of tigers those were, one bad experience could ruin your whole day. You'd be all eaten up. Nowadays, there's no tigers, but there's a lot of small stressors that we grab onto. So that suppose you were to go on a vacation and you had 1,000 positive experiences and somebody picked your pocket. You'd come home and somebody would say, how was your vacation? You'd say, it was pretty good, but I got my pocket picked. Right? That one negative experience would be the one that really stuck in your mind. But what they have found is that if you can, when you're experiencing one of these positive emotions or experiences, extend it and amplify it for 15 seconds. It doesn't Teflon through. It ends up going into the more permanent part of the memory banks. It creates a new neural pathway, and it begins to balance all those negative ones that we have been accumulating. Okay, so that when you're feeling good, can you really be with that? I mentioned before that Brene Brown factoid where nobody was joyful without a regular gratitude practice. And I thought about that, and if you're busy keeping a gratitude journal, or when you go to bed at night, you think about 3 things you're grateful for, that you're taking 15 seconds. You're anchoring that really positive feeling of gratitude. Can we bring gratitude into negative experience also? And by negative, I mean we're agitated, we're bored, we're tired, we're anxious. Those are showing us very specifically and accurately and even perfectly the places where you and I can open our hearts more. So once again, there's this tension between how much do you want to be free and how much do you want it not to hurt? And to the extent that we're pushing, we're grasping at, I don't want it to hurt, we're having to juggle, we're having to dodge, and ask each experience, is this one that's going to be a feel-good experience or a not feel-good experience? Whereas if our motivation is the truth, freedom, we don't have to do that juggling. We're diving in, we're dying into each moment, dying into the next moment. So we have about 15 more minutes on this very flexible schedule that I put together. I'd like to leave time for discussion. Please.
Why do you say dying into rather than living into the next moment?
Why do I say dying into the next moment? Okay, great question. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. The ego structure believes that. And as we're meditating or as we're having this discussion right now, moment to moment there is the option of either me busy being Dale, and I'm thinking, okay, how can I give the best answer to that interesting question? And there's this I who's trying to be in control and do the best possible job. Or there's this other possibility of trusting basic goodness, trusting Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and just being aware, not I'm being aware, but just awareness, surrendering into the next moment. Krishnamurti wrote a book called Freedom from the Known. What a great title. Do we need to know? Is there an I that needs to know? And compassion, as I said before, is this central point of practice that takes us eventually to non-duality, to this place where we go from, initially, most people are going through their lives identifying with the content of experience, the known. I am angry, I am afraid, I'm happy, I've got a pain in my knee. When we meditate enough, we begin to identify with the witness, the knower. Okay? And I'm saying then that the next stage is letting go of the knower and just having knowing. That the knower and the known collapse, and all that's left is this process of consciousness and content of consciousness being one, moment to moment to moment. No content without consciousness, no consciousness without content, which is why Buddhists have this weird idea that if a tree falls in the forest and there's no consciousness there, there's no sound. Because sound is sound waves meeting consciousness. Okay, so maybe this is taking this into theoretical a direction here, but my sense of it is that can I each moment be trusting my basic goodness, my true nature? I have a PhD in math. So that taught me not to trust, that I should figure out, I should analyze, and I would guess that almost everybody in the room makes a living by being clever in one way or the other. The sophisticated group of Northern Californian people who know how to analyze and figure things out. And the mind is a very wonderful tool and a very lousy master. So that we're letting go of this quality of the mind, thinking it knows what's going on, and trusting true nature. So that it's possible to think, what do you need to buy at the grocery store? What's going to happen when the all-day meditation is done? It's possible to use the mind consciously. You're grounded, you're centered, you're aware, your heart's open, and you're thinking. But often, when we're in the mind, we're identified with the mind. We're lost in the mind. So we're not dying into the next moment. We're clinging to thinking there's somebody who knows. There isn't somebody who knows. It's a delusion. It's a very common delusion. It's a very persistent delusion. Nobody there. Any other remarks or questions? Please, in the back.
I'm challenged by the notion, it's kind of theoretical, I don't know where it is, but I understand that this notion that we're all one and compassion is to be extended in, because when you think about other people's behavior, most bad behavior comes from suffering, so you want to embrace it and be present with it. But I'm sometimes challenged with the notion that somewhere there's a line, and some things, some people, some behavior is too toxic, and you're not doing the universe a favor by supporting it.
Okay, well, two responses come into my mind when you say that. The first is, there is absolutely no implication that by being compassionate, there is an appropriate, spontaneous, and wise response. That compassion doesn't mean being nice. My life strategy is, if I feel open-hearted and compassionate, I'm willing to do almost anything. And if my heart is closed, I fall back to being nice. Okay, but so compassion doesn't imply that you can't protest. You can't go out there and say, what's going on politically is something I don't agree with, and we've got to fight this. But you're doing it in a compassionate way, and that's why people like Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Lincoln and people who seem to be coming from their heart are people that are revered because they weren't reacting out of anger. At least that's the myth about such people, right? The other thing is that if in fact you're around something that's toxic and you're not able to open your heart to that, maybe you need to take a break. I mean, there are certainly people whose relationship with their families are such that they need to take some time off and not deal with, I've had groups where women have been abused by fathers and they're not ready to have compassion for dad and be around him. They need to have compassion for what's happened to them before they can be there with the abuser, if you will. So that it's the same with physical pain. Somebody is approaching death hypothetically, and they're in physical pain. They're taking opiates to deal with the pain. To the extent that they're using opiates to deal with the fear of pain, that's a shame. Because there are other ways to deal with the fear, but certainly take enough medication to deal with the pain itself. If you're not taking enough and you're tightening up all the time in relationship to the pain, then you're just creating more karma, if you will. So finding your relationship with the toxic, dealing with it compassionately, admitting your limitations, but remembering that compassion and spaciousness in no way implies that you're not going to be a warrior. Pema Chodron has a quote that I've said so many times I almost know it by heart. And she says something like, loving kindness and compassion both cultivate bodhicitta, the warm, awakening heart. But compassion is more difficult than loving kindness because it requires you willing to feel pain. Compassion practices daring. Compassion requires the training of a warrior because again and again, when pain arises, our impulse is to run away from it. And what's required by compassion is leaning into what we're afraid of. Softening in relationship to what we're afraid of instead of the unconscious hardening and resistance.
Can I just follow up? I appreciate what you said. That was helpful, but if you could just take it one step further, what does within the context of do no harm, what does an individual or a society do with an abuser who will not become conscious?
Put them in jail. What I'm saying is that if you are compassionate, that it has been my personal experience and my experience of the people around me, that if you are compassionate, your response will be wiser and more appropriate than if you are responding from anger, reactivity, fear. So for you to say, what's the response? It really depends on who you are, what your relationship with the person is, what kind of initials you have after your name, all these different things. But what we're saying is, in general, no matter what the situation is, it is wiser to trust compassion and wisdom, the two pillars of Buddhism, than trust the reactive mind. And that reactive mind is the product, for almost all of us, of the woundedness that we experienced as children. So that you look at people who are in power, people who are suffering, people who are causing problems. And the next stage after compassion, let me see if I can summarize this in the few minutes we have remaining. So the first turning of the wheel in Buddhism is Theravada Buddhism, Hinayana Buddhism, cultivating awareness. Hinayana meaning lesser vehicle, practicing so that I can become awakened. Buddhism then became Mahayana Buddhism, historically, greater vehicle, practicing for all beings. But then the third turning of the wheel was Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, which brings in the notion of empowerment, that you are the deity that you invoked in the beginning. So that if you are compassionate enough, you actually then become wisdom. You become Chinrezi. You become compassion. You become cutting through wisdom. It's not just some idea, or it's not just some tanka on the wall or some statue on the altar. It's who you are. And we're trusting, dying into the next moment, if you will, that the more we trust that dying, that letting go, that like right now, am I paying attention to what's going on inside of me, or is the paying attention coming from? Am I paying attention to my heart, or am I paying attention from my heart? Okay, and to the extent that I trust my heart, then this empowerment, and then finally non-duality, wholeness, what Eckhart Tolle, Adyashanti, Ramana Maharshi talk about, begins to arise in a very natural way. And these states of being aren't far away. They are places that we live in much of the day. But we don't notice it because it is so familiar. Where there's no reactivity, we're resting in spaciousness. So that right now, for example, listen to the sound of my voice. Your practice right now for the next few seconds is hearing. I'm talking, listening, talking. What is it that continues when I stop? Is there an awakeness, an aliveness, a sense of beingness that continues whether you're hearing or you're not hearing? If you watch your breath, there's an in-breath, there's an out-breath, an in-breath and an out-breath. What continues between the out-breath and the in-breath, between the in-breath and the out-breath? There's an awakeness that's always there, even when I am talking, or even when you are breathing. And can we begin then to be aware of that awakeness, that which does not change, rather than being so fixated on the changing content of experience, the dreamlike nature of our existence? Without becoming, I live in Marin, so without becoming Marin-like, right? Without just being this woo-woo, okay, it's all the dream. It's both. And that most of us, most of the time, are fixated at the level of that which is changing. And this is particularly important when we're working with somebody, or are somebody, who might be approaching death. So that there is this human dimension, all the different names and bodies and personalities that we just found out about in this room, but all that is contextualized in that which does not change, that which we can die into each moment. Any remarks about any of that? Please.
Question. What caused you to title this session Passion and Compassion?
Well, for the sake of the microphone here, what caused me to title this Passion and Compassion? Because, first of all, compassion literally means with passion. Secondly, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to have compassion for all the suffering we see in this world without all of our passion. And at the same time, the more compassion we have, the more it liberates our passion. Passion and compassion are very intimately interconnected. And I think it's a sexy title. I could have called it Compassion. You'd say, oh, okay. Mr. Tom.
So, Dale, I have a question. Maybe you can give me some
input and advice. So and this kind of relates to this idea of, when we get triggered or whatever, what Michael was talking about. So last night I got home, my neighbors downstairs were quite loud and boisterous, as they often are. They just had very loud voices. There was no music, so they carry on. They usually stop about midnight. So I put in my earplugs, I go to bed like I normally do. 2 a.m., I'm awakened by even louder vocalization. So I take an appropriate response. I, bang on the floor a little bit. It abates for about 60 seconds, and then it's back to full volume. So I get dressed, I go downstairs, I pound on the door. He doesn't open, he only uses, the latch to look out the little slot. So I use some choice words to, express my desire that things be lowered so I don't hear every expletive word, blah, blah, blah. Get back upstairs. It hasn't really stopped, but I'm full of adrenaline, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I do some exercises to abate the adrenaline, some hopping and tapping and jumping and,
I wish I could have seen that.
It was fun. So, I go to bed, but then, I'm hooked. Because, in my head, I'm going on okay, is this really going to stop? What am I do if I have to go downstairs a second time? Do I take a meat cleaver? All these things going on. And then it took quite a long time to finally get back to sleep. And when I do, my mind is going, how am I going to get this guy? I'm getting up at 7 a.m. If he's not going to bed till 4:30, guess what? He's going to want to sleep. So the music goes up, normal things that I would normally put off until later in the morning. So I find myself in this situation where my mind is completely taken away in a different direction than I would normally choose.
Right.
What advice would you have once you're there? I took what I think were appropriate responses to, not just he probably had a bad childhood and he's loud. That doesn't do any good. So I went down and did what I could. But once the mind is triggered, how do you bring it back?
Okay, well,
or do we have lunch?
we're supposed to start sitting soon. And that's a kind of a big question. It's really how does practice work when there are difficult emotions? And when one is triggered, as I said before, compassion isn't just for the other person, it's for yourself. And how can I summarize this? So that I am going to be teaching this workshop next Saturday where we really go into this in a lot more depth if anybody wants to come to that. And there's the Living Dying Project has a website where there are longer lectures about just this very topic. And for me, and I think for a lot of people, bringing practice back to the somatic, particularly when you're really hooked, is a very useful thing. You've been in my groups and you've heard me talk about getting grounded and getting centered.
I did the 8-lane breath last night.
And so there are developmental stages in early childhood, developmental stuff. Piaget talks about those things. 0 to 2, learning to be grounded, inhabiting the base. 2 to 5, inhabiting the lower belly, the place in which martial arts are done. 5 to 8, conscious relationships, having appropriate boundaries. And for many of us who are practicing Eastern disciplines, we haven't really necessarily done some of this foundation work, that there's very little about being grounded. It's assumed that you're grounded because, as I said before, these awareness practices assume that you're a happy, grounded, pretty unneurotic person. So that what's needed is enough humility that when you become reactive to what's going on, when the Tibetans call it shenpa, it's sticky, you're hooked. When you're hooked, can you be aware of that? And often it's hard to do that because it's so hot. Can you then get grounded? Can you inhabit the base of your torso? Can you drop into the lower part of your body? Can you begin to do the martial art of being Tom with rude neighbors? And in a way, all the practice boils down to what happens before practice, if you will, which is motivation. How strong is your motivation to be free versus how much do you want to be right? How much do you want people to like you? And if you really, really want to be free, if you really want to go beyond suffering, if you really want to go beyond fear, then this circumstance is this great opportunity to see a place where you're acting really automatically. You're not dying into the next moment. You're caught in, I'm right and they're wrong and screw them and I'm going to get back at them tomorrow. And compassion isn't necessarily thinking they had a bad childhood, but feeling the place where you're getting tight. Somatically, when we get into I, two things happen for almost everybody. The shoulders begin to arise. That's where this I'm going to do it. And the lower belly starts getting tight. Stephen Levine talked a lot about soft belly. So that when you start getting tight, release your shoulders, release your lower belly, and bring some strength down there. Like the martial art of, I'm going to deal with this. And what you do specifically, I can't predict. That it's you're getting as put together as you can, and then the action comes out of that. I would guess that choice words, whatever they might have been, probably inflame the situation to a certain extent. That these people are feeling, well, if he's going to come down and say, screw you, then screw him. It's like what I just said before about me in Vietnam protests. I'm saying, screw you, and then that generation said, screw me, and that went on for another 10 years. So that nonviolence takes a great deal of strength. And it does not mean not being strong, not being focused, not being responsive. Okay. Any other remarks? Jim.
Maybe we can just give me a quickie. If you're experiencing people who are suffering either physically or emotionally, how do you determine what the appropriate response is? Is it just to listen and to hold them in your heart, or is it to try to give them this tendency to try to fix it and give advice? And, it's such a fine line when you essentially seeing someone destroy themselves, and they're so fixated on their grief or their suffering.
Right. How do you help people who are suffering?
That's you said it so much better.
Okay. Well, first of all, it depends on what is the implied contract. If you come to me and you're paying me and I'm your therapist or your counselor or your doctor, that's one thing. If I'm walking down the sidewalk and I see somebody who's suffering, I'm probably not going to stop them and say, I see you're having a difficult time, let's sit down and talk about it. They might not like that too much. Okay, so let's assume that there is at least some kind of contract where the person is open to receiving some advice or help from you. And one thing I always try to remember, which I don't say to anybody, is that suffering is only suffering. And suffering is not caused by cancer, suffering is caused by resistance to cancer. Suffering is not caused by dying, it's caused by resistance to dying. I'm called to the bedside of people who are dying again and again. And there's the implicit contract that they're asking me for help, but in fact, really a lot of people aren't ready for help. So the first and the best thing is, can I be a living example of being present and compassionate? that I am an invitation, that you're suffering. I'm not saying I'm going to fix you or this is a big problem, but here I am, and I am working with what's arising in me with awareness and compassion. Sometimes out of that comes skillful means. Sometimes it doesn't. And that, once again, depends completely on the circumstance. So that at times you're just listening, but you're modeling the fact that every moment is open to awareness and compassion. So suppose that you're with somebody who's suffering a lot. Suppose you're with somebody who might be approaching death. And you're bothered by them. You're seeing a dying person. You're fixated on their identity. What message are they getting? They're getting the message that here's this guy who's not even dying, and he's having a problem. How much more difficult it is for me. I'm the one who's sick here. Whereas if you can be with what's coming up in you in response to that other person, then he or she is getting the message that this is a workable moment. Maybe they're not able to avail themselves of that message quite yet. Maybe they have to wait till it gets worse. And to try to pull people out of suffering until they're ready to do that themselves is often counterproductive. In the 12 steps, the first thing is something like, I've gotten to the point where my life is unworkable. And until you get to that point, you can meditate till your knees fall off. Or you can go to all these 12-step meetings or whatever it is you're doing, and until you really know that things need to change, it's not going to have much effect. Nothing's going to have too much effect. So that maybe the person needs to suffer more. But you have a hard time with that because it's resonating the suffering in you. So you want to fix them because their suffering is bothering you. Okay. So, lucky us, we got a shorter meditation. Okay. As well, I have, as I mentioned, an ongoing small group, maximum size 9 people, also in the Mission District, the one that Tom was in, and there's one space available now. So if you're interested in that, just fill out a 3x5 card with your name, address, and phone number, and then I'll give you a call. We can talk about it. Any other logistical issues? Okay. So I was going to, the schedule I had thought up at first was we were going to meditate now. And the food was so good, I think that's a bad idea. There would be too much snoring meditation, probably. So
snoring meditation.
And we're going to do an exercise and then do the sitting after that. Although, when you die, you might be really tired and full, or there might be a lot of morphine in your bloodstream. Or you might be in an automobile with the person you love the most in the world screaming in terror sitting right next to you. Or you might be lying on the floor of CBS Pharmacy and strangers are ripping your shirt off and pounding on your chest. So it isn't just meditating in a nice, supportive, quiet environment. It's opening up your computer and seeing that Paul Ryan has just decided he's not going to be running for re-election, or it's Jeff was telling me the first time he went to India was when they have this big celebration called the Kumbh Mela, which is basically a celebration that has how many million people? Several million people and no toilets. Like you can just imagine. Okay. When I was in India once, I was going with a friend, and we were stopped at an army checkpoint because there was some unrest, and we had a car all full of stuff for various reasons. So we had to get out and wait. And I went to a soldier and said, "Where's the bathroom?" And he said, "Talk to the lieutenant." I went to the lieutenant and I said, "Where's the bathroom?" And he said, "Sir, all of India is the bathroom." Anyway, I digress. So we're going to do an exercise that will be very hard to fall asleep doing. And what I'd like everybody to do is to find a partner who is not your best friend in the room and arrange your chair or your cushion or whatever so that you can sit and talk to this person. Some people can even go out on the couches there. And after that all commotion happens, I will explain what's going to happen next. If you don't have a partner, raise your hand. You're the odd man out? You're the odd person out? Does anybody not have a partner? You have to work with me. Okay. So, maybe before we start, you guys can be close up to the door to hear what's going on. And in each dyad, one of you choose to originally, we're going to do the dyad both directions. So it doesn't make too much difference, but for the original direction, pick whether you're going to be the speaker or the compassion. Wait a minute, which one? Are you going to be the questioner or the responder? Okay, just in each dyad, you guys pick. This is the hardest part of the exercise. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do. The questioner is going to ask the responder the question, what blocks your compassion? And the responder will answer. The questioner cannot say anything other than what blocks your compassion. It's a repeating question. You can't say, I know just a chiropractor for you, or that happened to me, which keeps it at the same level, so that as you're asked the question again and again, potentially the answer might begin to come from a deeper place. The person who's asking the question can sit there like a parrot and just ask the question, or you can be compassion. Compassion for your partner, compassion for yourself. Okay, so for about 12 minutes, sometimes we do it for a day. So just okay. So for 12 minutes, you're going to ask the question, the responder will answer. I will ring a bell, and at that point you will have 5 minutes to talk about what just happened in an unstructured conversation. I'll ring another bell. I will then say we're going to shift roles, and etc. Are there any questions other than you, and we'll take care of that in a minute, about what's going to happen next?
So I remember from our group we did dyads like this, and I don't remember if this was the one where you recommended like not a lot of validating, like nodding and
The fact that you're not yes. That no nodding, no saying, yeah, that's right, or the idea is that you're just encouraging the person to go into the question. Expressions, shaking head, answering. The most you can say is thank you, okay? And what blocks your compassion? Did you have your hand up?
I just wondered whether more light might help with wakefulness.
I don't know. You feel you need more wakefulness.
Well, you expressed
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yes.
Bring it to life.
You gotta click the switch.
Okay.
First one. It's the first one.
Thanks, Richard.
Sure.
So, why don't you plunk down right here in front of me somewhere? Any comments about that exercise?
I didn't hear any snoring.
Just you wait.
What?
Just you wait.
Did anybody learn anything other than you didn't hear snoring? Mr. Lindemood.
What occurred to me is that most of the times when I feel my compassion is blocked, is that I am maintaining some illusion of separateness. That I'll be used, or don't you know how much I'm dealing with, or that seems to be the crux of it.
Very good insight. I mentioned that compassion does have the quality of being connected. And in Buddhism there are what are called the near enemies for the wholesome qualities, the four Brahma Viharas or heavenly abodes. And the near enemy is something that looks like the wholesome quality, but it's actually an enemy that is not wholesome. So the near enemy of compassion is pity. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama suggests that compassion has the quality of being able to equalize and switch yourself with the other person, which implies being connected. So that burnout comes from pity. Burnout comes from the ego's attempt to maintain a safe distance from the suffering out there or in here. And in fact, I think that it's common, I can maybe, if I out my partner here, that we have the possibility of assuming that compassion is dangerous, that if we get too close to suffering, we might get sucked in. We might get lost in that. But in fact, there is wisdom in that connected, spacious heart, in that feeling of being equal to somebody rather than the effort it takes to stay separate or particularly above. Or in relationship to yourself, sometimes we put ourselves below. I'm no good, right? So is it possible to keep coming back to this feeling of connectedness? There's a wonderful book, and I don't remember the name of it or who wrote it, but what she said was, I'm a therapist and I noticed that some of my clients, my interaction with them really tired me out, and others didn't. So I thought, well, why is that? Why do some of these interactions exhaust me and some don't? And her first reaction was, it's probably the people that have the most intractable problems that exhaust me. When she looked a little closer, that was not the case. It was the clients that she didn't connect with that exhausted her, no matter how intractable or difficult or not difficult their issues were. So that when you notice that you're getting exhausted by your job or your relationship or whatever it might be, that more than likely there is some lack of compassion, some lack of connectedness. Remember, grief is the garden of compassion. Grief, separateness, compassion, connectedness. That our exhaustion, our burnout, comes from the ego's attempt to protect, to stay separate, to feel that vulnerability is dangerous. Now, beyond that, compassion, not even beyond that, as a direct result of this, compassion cuts at the very root the place where we cherish separateness, where we cling to being separate. So not only is like going back to that quote of the Dalai Lama's, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. And you will be happy because by practicing compassion, you'll be cutting through at the root, the place where you think you're special, where you think you need to protect yourself, where you think that the world out there is a dangerous thing. Well, at some level it is a dangerous event, having a body and a life. There's no doubt about that. But what is the most intelligent, wise, safest way to be in the world? And in my experience, it is to be connected. It is to be compassionate. So we've talked a lot about compassion theoretically. I'd like to bring up just two other important points. Very often in our society, we talk about what we do rather than what we receive. And love, compassion, gratitude, forgiveness, devotion, loving kindness, qualities of the heart, we often think of them as how do we create them, cultivate them, express them. But equally important is learning to receive the compassion from others, the loving kindness from others, the forgiveness, the gratitude from other people. And so many are embarrassed when somebody is expressing love or compassion. So that when that happens, then your job is to have compassion for the part of you that can't receive compassion. And when we're doing compassion practice, very often it gets difficult. And instead, let me just even give an example. A few months ago, a friend of mine called up, and I had helped him help both of his parents die over the years. And he said, and his father, he had a really difficult relationship with his father in particular. His father had been a Nazi and had been a guard in a camp in Serbia. And they moved to America, and his father allowed, I shouldn't go too much into this because it made too many details, but anyway, he had a very difficult relationship with his father. And he decided that one weekend he was going to sit down and do Tonglen, taking and sending practice, compassion practice for his father. And he's a very committed guy. He meditates really a lot. And after 2 or 3 days of this, he called me up and said, I just can't do it. I've been trying to feel compassion. I just can't do it. And I said, well, what you need to do is practice compassion for the part of yourself that can't feel compassion. And he started crying. So that wherever we find that we're caught, and it's often our compassion practice that shows us where we're caught, that we need compassion for that. And that's kind of more this dying into the next moment, where wherever we find ourselves, wherever we find ourselves blocked from the next moment, that's what's calling for compassion. There is a wisdom to how we suffer. There's a very perfect and specific wisdom that you're suffering and I'm suffering in the way that is perfectly pointing at what is asking to be healed next.
Dan? Right here, Dan.
So a question that's related to that.
Pardon me for doing this. Don't tell
It doesn't come up often for me, but it came up a few days ago with somebody who's been a long and difficult friendship I know from here initially, long ago. And it's the problem of expressing compassion for someone and feeling it sincerely, and they're taking it as, I don't need compassion, you're saying that there's something wrong with me or I'm weak. So there's some question about how to do it in a way that doesn't create that. This isn't a common problem I found, but imagine trying to do it for Donald Trump, for example.
Right. Well, so compassion implies there is a connectedness between you and this other human being. And if you're connected, you might feel that they're not ready for you to do something. That maybe being compassion is what's needed, and that that person isn't at a place of integration where they're able to receive help or loving kindness or compassion from somebody else. I don't think that's really uncommon. And once again, this thing of one has to get to the bottom before one says, okay, I'm willing to look at this and really change my behavior. And I mean, I've been around people who are going to be dying in the next week and had a strong feeling that if they said, I trust you, you can do anything you want, I could really, really help them. Help, whatever that means. But they're not ready to ask yet. They're still so mad at God and their body and the medical industry and whoever else that things haven't, that they're not really in touch with their own suffering. So for you to be saying, look, you've got suffering and I'm here to help you, not so much. So that compassion isn't always being nice. If you're a parent, you know that compassion sometimes means tough love. We're all probably pretty good at saying yes with an open heart and pretty good at saying no with an open heart. Tom goes downstairs, he says yes with an open heart, no with a closed heart. We're good at no with a closed heart, right? Go on that, shut up, you're making too much noise. Can we say no with an open heart? And so here's somebody who's suffering, and maybe the best thing you can do is just have an open heart. And I have been in very few situations in my life that are more uncomfortable than being around somebody who's open and I'm closed. The extreme example is being with my guru in India, Maharaj Nimkroli Baba. He's wide open. I'm Mr. Neurosis. I'm dying of thirst. He's an ocean of nectar, and I'm coming with a spoon with a hole in the bottom, right? So I've taken a spoonful of nectar, and by the time I get it to my mouth, there's just like a slight drop in the spoon. And so you being there in this loving way, maybe not saying anything about I'm here to help you, everybody's psychic, whether we admit it or not. You can feel when somebody's there, when somebody's open-hearted, when somebody's pretending to do that. And that maybe nothing will change overtly in the moment, but that eventually that message will worm its way in a little bit, that there's another way of being with this, that bringing awareness and compassion to the situation makes it workable, and that so that when I teach caregiving, what I teach is caregiving is work on yourself. It's not about helping the other person. When you're on the plane, they say put on the mask on you before you put it on the kid. And if you're there to help the other person, you're missing the signals in you where, oh my God, I'm not helping, or why can't I do it better? If you're with those signals, then you will be the best help to the other person by having compassion, having love, being aware of what's going on in you. So that maybe like 75% of your attention on your own signals, your own inner being, and 25% on the body language, what's going on out there. Another question over here, and then we're going to sit.
I think you just answered one. Thank you.
I answered it already?
Yes.
2 for 1? Okay. Okay. So the other thing we really didn't talk too much about is cultivating compassion. We talked about it. I think everybody knows what it is. I know everybody's experienced it. There is a wonderful practice that we're not going to have time to talk about today unless we maybe, I don't know, but probably we won't, called Tonglen, or taking and sending. On my website, there are a couple of articles about it, one by me, one by Joan Halifax, Roshi Joan Halifax. Pema Chodron talks about Tonglen a lot.
We've had a number of talks here,
Okay.
even recently.
So probably most of you know about it. To me, it's one of the most robust, strongest tools in my toolkit. And I really think there's a very direct and intimate connection between compassion, gratitude, and joy. That they're really 3 different names for the same thing in a certain sense. Any comments before we sit? Okay. Yes.
I have an odd question. If you
I would
talk
expect
about
nothing
the
less.
psychologist who connected with some of the clients and not with the others, when you feel a connection with someone, when you don't feel a connection with somebody, what can you do? I mean, like, when we did our session, that's the first time I've ever done that exercise without feeling threatened. So part of it was him, part of it was you, part of it was all this group of people.
Right.
But when you don't feel connected and you're ill at ease and you're uncomfortable, and you ground yourselves.
Okay. So there's a couple of qualities in spiritual life that are rarely talked about that I think are very crucial. Humility and flexibility. So that you're trying to feel compassion for somebody and you're not. And you're like my friend who called up and said, I tried to feel compassion for my dad for 2 or 3 days. I couldn't. Can you admit that you're not feeling compassion, that you're feeling bad about that? And what's needed is what? Compassion for yourself. That you have enough humility to say, I'm not doing what I set out to do here. It's shifted. And I need to then work with this place in myself and be flexible enough then to shift your whole notion of what's being asked of you in the moment. You start out thinking, I'm going to help these other people, I'm going to do this thing, but you can't do it. There's something in you that's being resonated, some blockage in you that's coming out in response to this particular interaction. So, the end of your question kind of implied it is a bit more complex than that. That if you can't have compassion for yourself, then can you take a step back and be aware of this uncomfortableness? And can that awareness even be embodied by being grounded and centered? And if you can't even feel that, like there's Tom pounding I guess we can't berate Tom because he's not even in the room. You can't even be aware of what's going on, then you go back to the very first step of what is your motivation? What do you really want? Do you want to be somebody who's pounding on the door and all pissed off, or are you somebody who wants to awaken? Right? And what is it I truly want in life? Suzuki Roshi, the founder of the San Francisco Zen Center, said, the most important thing is finding the most important thing. Okay, so in that moment where you're in that situation, what's the most important thing? The most important thing is awakening in that situation, becoming present, dealing with the part of you that doesn't feel compassion. There was one over here somewhere. Two people asked a question at the same time? No.
You already did.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. Okay, so let's see. So we're going to sit for 40 minutes. Let's take a 10-minute break where people can talk and go to the bathroom. I'll ring a bell and then go right from that to a 20-minute walking session. Okay. Let's ring the bell. Time for walking. So we will have one closing meditation. Toward the end of that meditation, I will read, as part of the meditation, a poem by Thich Nhat Hanh about compassion, which I'd encourage you to just let it come in as part of the meditation. And then there will be a dedicating of the merit with the wish that all beings might be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. Are there any remarks or questions before we begin this last period of sitting? The more we talk, the less you have to sit. There is that. Yes, sir.
Yes. The theme of this retreat is passion and compassion. And passion, often in my mind, is linked with desire, which does not seem to be a positive thing in the Buddhist teaching.
Desire bad.
Craving, I guess, is bad.
Okay, well, so I was a good Buddhist for a long time, full of misunderstanding, and I thought that desire was bad. And then I got involved in this Diamond Heart work, Rinduan school, age almost kind of stuff, kind of Sufism based, and I had this epiphany where I realized that desire for truth and God and love is a good thing. So in Buddhism, there's an important distinction between preference and attachment, as you probably know. Preference is the human condition You got up this morning and you said, I'm going to wear that black shirt with the red checks on it. Or maybe it fell out of the closet all by itself, who knows. But anyway, but if that shirt would have had a hole in it or been dirty, and you fell to the floor and said, my God, I wanted to wear that shirt, that would be attachment, right? So passion actually means suffering, like the Passion of Christ. That was the original meaning of the word, right? And it has changed its main meaning over many centuries, of course. Now, so passion, I don't think is really quite the same as desire. To me, it implies a kind of an intense aliveness. One can be really involved in passion and not be attached or not be lost in clinging, I would say. And in fact, in Buddhism, there are what are called the jhanas, or deeper states of concentration, which are difficult to practice in an ordinary non-monastic life. But certainly one can go into concentrating on the breath So there's a difference between being mindful of the breath and concentrating on the breath, right? Everybody knows the difference between concentration and mindfulness. Anybody isn't completely clear about that?
Enlightenment.
Concentration, as Mr. Webster would say, is the ability to put your mind on one thing and push everything else away. And in fact, we've all heard stories and maybe have been someone who was so busy writing or making music or doing something creative that we didn't hear the phone ring, or we didn't remember to eat or urinate or whatever it might be. Concentration temporarily suppresses causes of suffering but does not uproot them. And one can feel great passion in deep concentration. Awareness, on the other hand, is the ability to keep the mind in the ever-changing present. Awareness uproots the causes of suffering, because if you're aware of the breath and then you become aware that you're not with the breath but you're thinking about something, or you're being bothered by the pain in your knee, that awareness of how suffering arises, or the awareness of impermanence, or the awareness of no permanent ongoing self, creates freedom from clinging, freedom from suffering. So one can have passion for truth. One can have sexual passion where you're lost in the passion in a way that causes suffering, or one can find freedom through experiences that take us beyond identification with separateness. And whether that's through a near-death experience, through psychedelic drugs, through meditation, through an epiphany, through being in nature, through sexuality, there's so many different ways. Consciousness doesn't care how you get there. It doesn't care how long it takes, and it doesn't care how much it hurts along the way. The function of consciousness is to grow and change, to realize eventually that we are that which is whole, that which is beyond fear. So the Buddha has this really weird notion that everybody you meet's been your mother. Whoa, okay. I like to look at it, if everybody's been my mother, then everybody's been my child. It's much more easy for me to see people as my children than my mother for some reason. But the point is that we're connected in that way. And can that lead to a kind of compassion that's very passionate, that the suffering of other people generates compassionate activity, compassionate response. We've talked a lot about compassion as a theoretical notion, not so much necessarily about compassionate action. And the assumption here is that when you feel compassion, certainly at times, at many times, compassionate activity will be naturally arising out of a compassionate feeling. Not always. Sometimes, as we said before in response to something over in this part of the room, that maybe compassion is being quiet. Maybe compassion is letting somebody suffer more. Let me read the Thich Nhat Hanh poem right now instead of during the meditation. It's called Call Me By My True Names. And you may or may not know that Thich Nhat Hanh was a Vietnamese monk, and when after the war or during the war or something, he was in these refugee camps where there were many people that were displaced and suffering greatly, and he set up a temple where thousands of people came, and not only had compassion for his suffering countrymen, but for the people that were, in a sense, causing that suffering. Please call me by my true names. Do not say that I will depart tomorrow, because even today I still arrive. Look deeply. I arrive in every second to be a bud on a spring branch, to be a tiny bird with wings still fragile, learning to sing in my new nest, to be a caterpillar in the heart of a flower, to be a jewel hiding itself in a stone. I still arrive in order to laugh and to cry, in order to fear and to hope. The rhythm of my heart is the birth and death of all that are alive. I am the mayfly metamorphosing on the surface of the river, and I am the bird which, when spring comes, arrives in time to eat the mayfly. I am the frog swimming happily in the clear pond, and I am the grass snake who, approaching in silence, feeds itself on the frog. I am the child in Somalia, all skin and bones, my legs as thin as bamboo sticks, and I am the arms merchant selling deadly weapons to Somalia. I'm the 12-year-old girl refugee in a small boat who throws herself into the ocean after being raped by a sea pirate. And I am the sea pirate, my heart not yet capable of seeing and loving. I am a member of the Politburo with plenty of power in my hands. And I am the man who has to pay his debt of blood to my people dying slowly in a forced labor camp. My joy is like spring, so warm it makes flowers bloom in all walks of life. My pain is like a river of tears, so full it fills all four oceans. Please call me by my true names, so I can hear all my cries and laughs at once, so I can see that my joy and pain are one. Please call me by my true names, so I can wake up, and so the door of my heart can be left open, the door of compassion. So wherever our heart closes, in relationship, in the political arena, in walking down the sidewalk, in looking into a mirror, can we have the courage coming from the French root word coeur, meaning heart, to be with that contraction, have compassion for it, open to that? Most of us say things to ourselves that if we heard somebody else saying those things to us, we would not consider them our friend. If you heard your friend saying to you the ways you judge yourself, would you want to be around that person? Would you feel that person had your well-being at heart and was your friend for life? And that's the person you're living with, is you and me. Any other remarks or questions before our final sit?
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.